Very good evening, everyone. My name is Abhijit Suresh. I'm a polity instructor. Apart from polity, I also teach international relations. Apart from being an instructor, I am also a policy researcher with a special focus on geopolitics. In today's session, we'll be discussing the introduction into Indian polity or the Indian Constitution, and as a part of that, we'll be discussing the salient features with respect to the Indian Constitution. But before we get to the salient features of the Indian Constitution, let us first try to understand what the Indian Constitution is based upon, what does it do, and also look at a quick or a brief history into the making of the Indian Constitution, and then we'll discuss some of the salient features associated with the Indian Constitution. There are multiple salient features associated with the Indian Constitution. We'll not be able to cover all of them today, so we'll be discussing a few of them today. So let's get started with the introduction into Indian Constitution with respect to what a constitution is, what it does, and a brief history with respect to the same. So the Indian Constitution, or the Constitution, as the word suggests, constitutes or constituted the Indian state. And so therefore, the Constitution laid down the basic principles and framework of the Indian state, and therefore it defines and enumerates the characteristics and the very fundamental nature of the Indian state. And therefore, to understand Indian polity and the Indian state, we must understand and study the Indian Constitution. Now, to look at a quick brief into the idea of or the making of the Indian Constitution, as the demand for self-rule started to increase, especially after the Home Rule movement of led by Annie Besant and Tilak, the need for a constitution or a constituent assembly to be framed, or a constituent assembly to be established to frame a constitution without any outside interference started to get a lot of traction, especially from leaders of that time, from freedom leaders of that time, for example, M.N. Roy and Jawaharlal Nehru. The demand for establishing a constituent assembly was accepted in principle in 1940 through the August offer, but it actually came in, or it was actually proposed through the Cripps proposal of 1942, where it essentially said that after the Second World War, a constituent assembly would be established would be established, and the constitution would be framed. However, that proposal did not go through because of opposition from the Indian Muslim League, who rejected this particular proposal. Finally, in 1946, through the cabinet mission, the Constituent Assembly for Undivided India was established, or was constituted. Again, it is important to realize, or it is important to emphasize, that it was for undivided India that the Constituent Assembly was constituted. And so therefore, in the Constituent Assembly, you had both members from present day India and present day Pakistan who were part of the Constituent Assembly initially. It was after the independence that these members or it grew apart. Now, when the demands for the establishment or the constitution of a constituent assembly was made, most people, especially Jawaharlal Nehru, had made these demands with an additional property with respect to this constituent assembly, that the members of this constituent assembly should have been elected through basic universal through universal adult franchise. However, in 1946, when finally the Constituent Assembly was framed, the members were not elected based on universal adult franchise. Some members came from the region of the Indian subcontinent that was under the British. Some members came from the princely states, but these members were not elected by the general population. These members were elected by the representatives of either those princely states or uh, those parts of the or those provinces of the British of British India. Now, once the Constituent Assembly was constituted, they conducted multiple meetings from 1946 to 1949, and finally, on the 26th of November of 1949, the Constitution was adopted, which contained the preamble and multiple other articles and schedules. The preamble was enacted, and this is important again. The preamble was enacted, although the preamble comes before the Constitution, it was enacted after the Constitution had already been enacted. So it is after the Constitution was enacted that the preamble was enacted. And when the Constitution was adopted on the 26th of November of 1949, the preamble was also part of this new Constitution. Now, another point is that the 26th of November of 1949 is today celebrated as Constitution Day. Now, some provisions of the Constitution, although the Constitution was adopted on the 26th of November of 1949, the entire Constitution did not come into effect on the 26th of November. It came into effect on the 26th of January of 1950. The reason they selected this particular date for the enforcement of the Constitution was because it was on this day that in 1930, the Indian National Congress had celebrated as Purna Swaraj Day, which was the direct result of a similar resolution, for this that was passed by the Indian National Congress during its Lahore session of December 1929. Now, this date of 26 January 1950 is today celebrated as Republic Day. Now, although the entire Constitution came into effect on the 26th of January 1950, the day that we today celebrate as Republic Day, the entire Constitution, or it was only a major portion of the Constitution that came into effect on that particular day. Some portions of the Constitution, primarily those portions which were required for the functioning of the state from between 1949 to 50, were already in force on the 26th of November 1949. Let me repeat. On the 26th of November of 1949, certain provisions of the Constitution came into effect, specifically those that were required for the functioning of the Indian state, while the rest of it, which constituted the majority of the Constitution, came into force on the 26th of January 1950, which is today celebrated as Republic Day. Now, now that we've discussed what the Constitution is, or what is the relevance of the Constitution, what is the relationship between the Constitution and the Indian state, and we've also discussed a brief history into the making of the Constitution, let's discuss certain salient features with respect to the Indian Constitution in particular. Now, according to the book on Indian polity by M. Lakshmikant, there are 17 salient features associated with the Indian Constitution, which are: one, that it is the lengthiest written constitution in the world. Second, it has been drawn from various sources. Third, It is a blend of rigidity and flexibility. Fourth, federal system with a unitary bias, parliamentary form of government, synthesis of parliamentary sovereignty with judicial supremacy, integrated and independent judiciary, fundamental rights, directive principles of state policy, also called DPSPs, fundamental duties, a secular state, universal adult franchise, single citizenship, independent bodies, emergency provisions, three-tier governments, and cooperative societies. We'll be discussing the first 7 of these salient features. Let's take up the first salient feature, which is of that being the Indian Constitution being the lengthiest constitution in the world. Now, we also need to understand as to why it is the lengthiest constitution in the world. What contributed to the bulk or it being so bulky? Now, the Indian Constitution is comprehensive, it is detailed, and it is elaborate. So, it touches upon everything and it encompasses everything associated with the Indian state. It lays down the framework for the political system of India, the duties of Indian citizens, the rights that are available to the Indian citizens, the limitations on those rights, and the structure of the government of India. Let me repeat. It encompasses or it enumerates or it enlists or it lays down the framework of the political system in India, the duties that are on the Indian citizens, the rights of the Indian citizens, the limitation on these rights, and the structure of the Indian government. Now, again, why so bulky? There are 4 fundamental reasons for the bulky nature of the constitution or for the length of the constitution. One, the geographical factors that the Indian subcontinent provides or the contours of the Indian state provided to the makers of the constitution, the challenge that it proposed, the diversity not only in terms of the geography of the land but also in terms of its people and the culture of the people. Since all of these needed to be accounted for and addressed, therefore it lent to a huge degree to the length of the constitution. The second factor is associated with historical factors. Why historical factors? Because the Indian constitution was primarily based on the Government of India Act of 1935, which was already a fairly big, bulky document. It was based on that further articles were added or further amendments were made or further things were added to that particular constitution, sourced from various places, of course. But essentially, a huge part of the bulky nature of the constitution is also contributed by the bulky nature of the Government of India Act of 1935, based on which the Indian Constitution was written. Next, you only have a single constitution for both the center and the state. Unlike for certain scenarios in the United States, wherein some states, wherein states have their own constitutions as well. In India, you have a single constitution for both the center and the state, and therefore you need to address the nuances associated with different states as well. For example, certain states would need to be given certain privileges. For example, there is a sixth schedule which addresses the needs of multiple states, primarily in the Northeast, and various other provisions as well. There are multiple articles as well. There was the article of 370, or a better term to use would be that it is no longer valid, the article 370, which was applicable for Kashmir. Next, the dominance of legal luminaries in the Indian Constitution or the Constituent Assembly. Because the people who were writing the Constituent Assembly, the members of that particular Constituent Assembly, a huge proportion of those people were lawyers, and therefore their legal expertise and their intent to be precise with the language that they're using for this legal document also lent to the fact that the Indian Constitution turned out to be one of the lengthiest of the world. Now, the next salient feature associated with the Indian Constitution is that it was drawn from various sources. As I've already mentioned, the Indian Constitution was primarily based on the Government of India Act of 1935. Apart from the Government of India Act of 1935, there were multiple other countries whose constitutions were also studied and sourced from to create this constitution. And therefore, we can divide the different aspects that have been chosen from various other constitutions or the Government of India Act of 1935 to understand where most of these provisions come from and what or which part of the world has contributed, or the ideas of which part of the world have contributed to certain ideas associated with the Constitution. So if you are to analyze, you'll realize that the structural aspect associated with the Indian Constitution is fundamentally based on the Government of India Act of 1935. If you have to look at the philosophical components associated with the Indian Constitution, you'll realize that a majority of these components were derived out of the American and the Irish constitutions. From the American Constitution, you had the fundamental rights, and from the Irish Constitution, you had the directive principles of state policy. When you come to political components, you'll realize that most of the political components or aspects associated with the Indian Constitution came from the British Constitution. For example, the principle of cabinet government, the relationships between the executive and the legislature. We also, the parliamentary system of Britain was also emulated here, and multiple similar components or aspects. Apart from these, there were other sources as well. For example, the constitutions of Canada, Australia, Germany, the USSR, France, South Africa, Japan, and others. And multiple such provisions that were sourced from these countries, or that were sourced from the constitutions of these countries, included, but not limited to, the powers of the governors of the state, emergency provisions that are present in the Indian Constitution. These were all sourced from other parts of the country. The fundamental duties, sorry, not fundamental duties. Now, the fundamental duties that you have, they were also sourced from other parts of the or other constitutions. Another salient feature associated with the Indian Constitution is that it is a blend of both rigidity and flexibility. Now, when we analyze the various salient features of the Indian Constitution, you'll realize that there was always a pull between the British Constitution or the British structure of government and the American structure of government. This is one of those examples wherein you have a rigid constitution, for example, the American Constitution, and a flexible constitution, for example, the British Constitution, And there is always a tussle between the two because these are extreme ends of that spectrum. And what India has done is that we have beautifully synthesized the two or blended the two together, wherein we have adopted features that are relevant for us from the American Constitution and the ones that are relevant for us from the British Constitution and that have worked for us and that have worked for those countries as well have been adopted and blended to create a unique mixture. Now, what is a rigid constitution? A rigid constitution is one which is very difficult to amend, which needs a special procedure for its amendment. For example, the American Constitution. Every amendment in that constitution has to go through a significant amount of process and procedure. Now, while it is easier for the Indian state to amend its constitution, it is not uniform throughout the constitution, which is to say that it is not easy to amend the ease with which you can amend the constitution is not uniform throughout the constitution. Depending on what you need, what you're trying to amend, there are different provisions to amend those parts. Now, before we get to those, let's also discuss the flexible constitutions that you have. For example, the British Constitution. What is a flexible constitution? Which is easier for you to amend. For example, in Britain, amending the constitution is as simple or is very simple. The procedure associated with it is very similar to that of enacting a law. Whereas that is not the case for the American Constitution. Now, how has India synthesized or blended these two ideas? So we identified certain regions of the or certain parts of the constitution which would not impact various things and therefore which could be easier or which if amended with simpler procedures would not have too great of an impact on the functioning of the state or on the vision of the state or the Indian subcontinent. They were brought under or uh, a provision was made or provisions were made to ensure that certain parts of the constitution could be amended using a simple majority of the parliament in the same process as ordinary legislatures are passed. Another method or certain other areas which were more crucial to amend those parts of the constitution, the Constituent Assembly introduced Article 368, which provided two types of amendments. One, a special majority of the parliament, where you needed to get a two-third majority of the members of each house present and voting, and a majority of the total membership of the entire house. Second, so that is the first type of special majority of the parliament. The second special majority of the parliament is where you have a special majority as in the previous case, but apart from that, you also get that law ratified by more than half of the total states of the Indian Republic. And primarily those parts of the constitution that affected the federal structure of the constitution which directly impacted the states, for those to be amended it would have to require the ratification of more than half of the states. Now this ensures that a unilateral amendment of the constitution with respect to provisions that affect the federal structure of the state of the Indian government of the Indian state and also the federal units of the in India, namely the states, will not be done without their consent or without them having any say. You of course have the upper house where you have members from these states who will also be part of the special majority process. But apart from that, the states will also have to ratify that law to ensure that a significant amount of representation is provided to the federal structures as well, federal units as well. Now, the simple majority that I'd mentioned earlier, that would not come under the article of or the provisions of Article 368. So it is a blend of rigidity and flexibility. Now again, it is a blend of the federal system and a unitary system, but it is not exactly. So if you were to compare between the two, you'll realize that there is a slant towards the unitary, towards a strong center, or there is a unitary bias. So it is a federal system with a strong unitary bias. Multiple scholars have called it, have used different phrases to explain the same idea, which are that India is federal in form but unitary in spirit. Some have also said that it is quasi-federal. Others have said that it is bargaining federalism. Some have said that it is cooperative federalism. Some have said that it is a federation with a centralizing tendency. Therefore, the Indian Constitution consists of both federal and unitary features, but there is a slant towards these unitary features. Now let's discuss what these federal features are. The federal features are that you have two governments, a government at the center and governments at the state levels. Division of powers. Division of powers between the center and the state, where you have three different lists: the union list, the concurrent list, and the state list, where the center would enact laws on items in the union list. The states would enact laws on items in the state list, and both can enact laws on items in the concurrent list. But if there is ever a difference of opinion between the center and the state, the opinion of the center would prevail, and again pointing to a unitary bias. Next, you have a written constitution, which also makes it rigid in the sense that you have a written down constitution for both the center and the state. Next, supremacy of the constitution. As I mentioned, rigidity of the constitution, an independent judiciary, and finally, bicameralism. Bicameralism is the existence of two houses in the parliament, an upper house and a lower house, wherein the upper house consists of members who have been elected from the states and therefore contributing a federal nature to the Indian Parliament. Now, what are the unitary features? The unitary features consist or include a strong center, single citizenship. You don't have multiple citizenship for each state. You have a single citizenship for the entire country. Single constitution, again, no multiple constitutions for different states, a single constitution. Flexibility of the constitution, which means that there is only one entity that can amend the constitution. If the amendment is to affect the federal structure of the Indian government, of the Indian state, then, or for multiple other reasons as well, then the different states of, or the different federal units of the Indian state will have to ratify, or at least 50% of the states will have to ratify that particular amendment to get it passed. But fundamentally, there is only one entity that can amend the Indian Constitution, which is the central government, or which is the Parliament. And since it is flexible and it can be amended only by the Parliament, which forms the central government, therefore, again, there is a unitary bias. Next, an integrated judiciary. Now, this, unlike the United States, where you have courts in different states implementing laws of those states alone, but federal or uh, federal laws being enacted by the Supreme Court of the United States. In India, the central laws or the federal laws are implemented not just by the Supreme Court, but also by the multiple high courts and district courts as well. And because there is an integrated judiciary, which is also hierarchical in nature, it ensures that the Indian state has a unitary bias, or it is unitary in nature. Next, the appointment of state governors by the center. Any law that is enacted by, so at the central level, any law that is enacted by the Parliament becomes a law, or that is passed or adopted by the Parliament, that is passed by a Parliament, becomes a law after the President signs on it, or the President gives his or her consent. At the state level, this duty is played by the state governor. The appointment of the governor is done by the center. And therefore, again, an example of unitary feature. All India services, the three services, Indian Administrative Service, Indian Foreign Service, Indian Police Service, all three are all India services, and the rest are central services which also provide their services. But the point being that an all India service, which is to an extent, of course, governed by the states, but primarily is under the union. And finally, emergency provisions, which are solely with the center. The three emergency provisions that the Indian state has: one, the emergency during armed rebellions or war; second, emergencies on states, also called the president's rule; and finally, financial emergency, which has never been applied on India. The term federation has nowhere been used in the Indian Constitution. Further, Article 1 describes India as a union of states, which implies two things. One, that the Indian Federation was not a result of agreement among multiple states, as was in the case of the United States. In India, the Indian Federation was not a result of the agreement between the various states. And second, no state has the right to secede from the federation. Now, the next salient feature associated with the constitution is that it is the parliamentary form of government that India has. Now, there is, again, this is also an example of a tussle between a parliamentary form of government and a presidential form of government, between the British form of government and the the American form of government. In Britain, you have a parliamentary form of government, whereas in the United States, you have a presidential form of government. The two most common forms of government are the parliamentary and the presidential. The parliamentary system is the cooperation and coordination between the legislative and executive organs. Why? Because the head of the executive comes from the legislature, comes from the not the legislature, comes from the legislative. It is the parliament that forms the legislative assembly of the state of the country, because they enact laws, or they indulge in creating legislature, they elect the prime minister and his cabinet of the prime minister then selects his cabinet of ministers. But since they select the head of the government, therefore the person comes from the parliament as well. The prime minister and his cabinet of ministers come from the parliament, and therefore there is no clear distinction between the legislature and the executive, because it is this prime minister and cabinet of ministers that form the executive, who then enact or implement laws that the parliament has passed. Therefore, the parliament acts as the legislature, and the prime minister and his cabinet of ministers act as the executive. And because the prime minister and his cabinet of ministers come from the parliament, therefore there is no clear distinction between the legislature and the executive. So therefore a cooperation and coordination between the legislature and the or legislative and the executive organs, whereas in the presidential system there is a clear separation of powers between the two organs. And this is seen in the United States, wherein you have a Congress, which is the legislative organ, and then you have the president, who is the executive organ, who's part of the executive organ. So the Congress enacts and passes laws. Sorry, the Congress passes laws, and the president implements or enforces these laws. India has a parliamentary form of government. And some of the features associated with the parliamentary form of government in India is the presence of nominal and real executives. The nominal executive is your president, and the real executive is the prime minister and his cabinet of ministers, or the prime minister. A majority party rule, collective responsibility of the executive to the legislature. So in India, you do not have a scenario where you can pass a no confidence motion against one minister. A no confidence motion is passed against the entire government. So there is a collective responsibility of that entire government to the parliament. At any point in time, if the parliament feels that the government as a whole, as a collective, does not enjoy its confidence, the members of the parliament, there are various procedures to this, of course. Some members of the parliament can ask for a no confidence motion, and if that no confidence motion passes, it essentially means that the parliament does not have any confidence in the government as a whole, and therefore the entire government will have to resign. So again, there is a collective responsibility of the executive to the legislature. Next, membership of the ministers in the legislature. As I already mentioned, the leadership of the prime minister or the chief minister, and the dissolution of the lower house, Lok Sabha or the assembly. So if no if no member of the parliament, or if no political party is of the parliament is able to prove their majority, then the lower house would be dissolved and new elections would be held, which is also an example of the parliamentary form of government, which will not be present in the presidential form of government. It wouldn't matter to the election of the or to for the creation of a set of real executives for a particular party to have a majority in the Congress or in the legislative organ for the presidential form of government, but it is absolutely necessary for the parliamentary form of government. Next is the synthesis of parliamentary sovereignty and judicial supremacy. Again, a tussle between the British form of government and the American form of government. In America, you have judicial supremacy, whereas in Britain, you have parliamentary sovereignty, which is to say that parliamentary sovereignty is the supremacy of the parliament. That is the parliament is superior to the executive and judicial branches. Whereas in judicial supremacy, the highest authority to a country, the highest authority in the country is the judiciary, allowing it to review and determine the validity and legitimacy of any action taken by the legislature, executive, or even the judiciary. In India, you neither have complete parliamentary sovereignty, neither do you have complete judicial supremacy. It is again a synthesis, a blend of the two. The synthesis of parliamentary sovereignty and judicial supremacy in the Indian Constitution is a unique approach to balance the legislature and the judiciary. Now, associated with parliamentary sovereignty is the concept of the procedure established by law, and associated with judicial supremacy is the idea or the doctrine of due process of law. Let's discuss what what the difference between the two are, and then we'll get back to the original idea. Now, what is procedure established by law? Procedure established by law essentially says that if the parliament has enacted a particular law, that law will never be questioned, in the sense, if the law has been enacted or has been passed by the parliament, as long as the government acts in accordance with the procedure that has been established by this law, the action of the government will be considered legal. So it is regardless of whether the procedure is fair, just, or reasonable, as long as it sticks to the word of the law that was enacted, the action would be considered legal. Whereas when you come to the due process of law not only checks if the action of the government was in accordance with the procedure established by law, but before that it takes a step back and analyzes the law as well, and tries to analyze as to if the law that was enacted by the parliament, if it was in accordance with fairness, justice, and the protection of individual rights with respect to that particular law. Which is to say that a parliament cannot enact a law or pass a law that is not fair, just, reasonable, or one that denies people of their individual rights, again without any fairness, justice, or reason. There can be limitations on individual rights of people, but that will have to be reasonable. Now, if you're to analyze these two doctrines, you'll realize that in the first case, if the parliament has enacted a particular law, then it does not matter what the law says. It doesn't matter if the law itself is fair, just, or reasonable, as long as the government follows to the T as to what is written. And you'll therefore realize that there is an immense amount of power given to the parliament to be able to enact any law, irrespective of it being fair, just, or reasonable, and therefore the idea of parliamentary sovereignty. Whereas for due process of law, the entity that checks the parliament, which is the judiciary, has the power not only to check the executive's actions, to analyze as to if the executive's actions are in accordance with the law that was passed by the parliament, but also to analyze the law itself that was passed by the parliament, to analyze as to if it is fair, if it was fair, if it was just, if it was reasonable, and if it provides protection to individual rights, and even if there are limitations on those individual rights, where are those limitations reasonable or not? And therefore you'll realize that there is a supremacy of the judiciary that emerges out of this doctrine, because it is the judiciary then that decides if the law that was enacted by the parliament was fair, just, reasonable, and if the limitations of on individual rights was reasonable or not. In India, you have a synthesis of the two. There are certain regions where the parliament has sovereignty, but there are certain other regions which are primarily associated with the powers to review that are given to the judiciary, that you have the due process of law in India as well, wherein you have both parliamentary sovereignty and judicial supremacy. The Supreme Court, on the one hand, can declare the parliamentary laws as unconstitutional through its power of judicial review. The Parliament, on the other hand, can amend the major portion of the Constitution through its constituent powers. So you have both parliamentary sovereignty and judicial supremacy. And therefore, when you to analyze Indian polity, when we are to study Indian polity in detail, you'll also realize, or you'll come across various instances throughout the 70 years, 75 years of our history of the history of the Indian state, where there has been a constant struggle, constant tussle between the parliamentary sovereignty, between the concept of parliamentary sovereignty and judicial supremacy. Now, the next idea is associated with an integrated and independent judiciary. Now, the Indian Constitution establishes an integrated and independent judicial system with the Supreme Court at the top of the hierarchy, followed by high courts at the state levels and a hierarchy of other subordinate courts, including district courts, below them. This single system of courts enforces both state and central laws, unlike the United States. The Constitution has made various provisions to ensure the independence of the Supreme Court as well, which include security of tenure of the judges, fixed service conditions for the judges. All the expenses of the Supreme Court are charged on the Consolidated Fund of India. Prohibition on decisions or on discussion of the conduct of judges in the parliament or in the legislatures. Ban on practice after retirement. Power to punish for its contempt vested in the court. Separation of the judiciary from the executive, and so on. So these are the various provisions, or these are some of the various provisions that are provided in the Indian Constitution, which ensures the independence of the Supreme Court or of the judiciary. So we'll wrap up today's session with this salient feature. We'll discuss the rest of it in the next class or in the next session. Thank you so much for joining in. Thank you.